class, so I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end so that we can have a conversation about all of this. First, let me start with a disclaimer, this idea of a Jew from Argentina. That is, how do I come to be a Jew from Argentina? I call it today an accident of history. Both my parents were immigrants from Germany before the Holocaust. My mother's family had left Berlin for Prague in 1933. And in 1936, my grandfather decided that Prague wouldn't be far enough, and so they left for Argentina. In my father's family, my father was sent to Argentina by my grandparents in 1939, while they still remained in Germany for a few months longer until they had to leave. And so my parents arrived in Argentina. They were teenagers. They met in Argentina. They got married in Argentina. They were part of the German Jewish community in Argentina, which, interestingly enough, we are so clubbish in our Jewishness that by 1950, there were in Buenos Aires 7 new German Jewish congregations. Each one of them distinguished by the geographic region in Germany where these Jews came from. So, you think Ashkenazi Sephardi is not enough? I'll give you 6 different tastes of being German Jewish, if you want to talk about differences. And in my family, as it happens to be, I am one of 4 children. I have 3 sisters. 2 of my nephews live in Spain. 2 of my nephews live in Israel. 2 of my nephews live in New York. My daughters live in the west coast of the United States. And I have 1 nephew left in Argentina who's going to the university, and probably not long after he graduates, he will not remain in Argentina. So this rabbi's Argentina experience is sort of an accident of history. The Gretz family, or this branch of the Gretz family, will have been in Argentina in transition from being refugees from Germany to wherever the next step in this Jewish migration will take them. So people are surprised I don't look very Argentinian. In fact, I don't look like these Jews here that I wanted to share with you, and I'll tell you more about them later. I can just, can use some sort of, see, these are 3 Jewish gauchos. The picture is from 1930, and I'll talk more about them. And their names are Jacobo Senderey, Moises Rosenfeld, and Moises Ribak. Okay? And there were 3 gauchos in Argentina, and I'll talk a little bit about the gauchos in Argentina, because that's probably one of the tastes of being different, of what happened different. In terms of how Jews in general got to Argentina, well, they got to Argentina not very different than they got to the United States. The same migration currents, and it had to do with availability of visas and how easy or how hard it was to get into this country, which then made it easier to get into other countries because it was hard to get in here. With regard to the German Jewish immigration of the 30s, 40s, and post-Holocaust, you know that there were restrictions placed in American immigration into the United States. So Jews went wherever they could get visas, and Argentina was a non-discriminating visa seller. So if you went to the consulate, the Argentinian consulate in Berlin, and you wanted to go to Argentina and you had money, you could bribe somebody to get a visa. So when people ask me, well, Argentina accepted all these Nazis after the war, they didn't really accept them because they were Nazis. They accepted them because they went to the consulate and paid a good bribe to get a visa to Argentina when they couldn't get anywhere else. We all get they were non-discriminatory in terms of selling their visas. And that's how Jews got to Argentina at that time. Looking at the currents, there's obviously a current of Jews that went to South America already with the Spanish and Portuguese colonization. And that then was sort of stuck in this hemisphere when the Inquisition came. The Inquisition came first in Spanish-conquered South America, and it then came into Brazil. You all know the story of the Jews Recife, which was a Dutch colony from the Dutch Indies Company. And when the Portuguese expelled the Dutch and they took over, the Jews had to flee Recife because the Inquisition was coming in with the Portuguese, and they ended up going where? To New Amsterdam, and were some of the early inhabitants of what later became New York. So, currents of immigration. There are strong cultural differences between Jews in Argentina, or between the communities in Argentina and Brazil, and how they were integrated into the countries, both in Argentina and Brazil. And part of the difference is who colonized these countries. The Portuguese, because there was always a small country surrounded by water to the outside, to the larger oceans, was always open in a way and receptive of the other. They were always going in search of the other because they were limited by a mountain here and the rest was water, and wherever they looked. When they got to Brazil, they brought that openness to them. And if you go 200 and some odd years later to Brazil today, you can feel the openness in the Brazilian spirit. Argentina was colonized by the Spanish. And the Spanish were different. The Spanish were, from times immemorial, Catholic Spain was somewhat xenophobic, inward-looking. And if you look at the map of Spain, it's an inward map. Here is the mountain, and here is just that little water, that's the Mediterranean. And they always were concentrating on themselves, and they were fairly self-sufficient to themselves, and they took and imposed their culture on the countries that they colonized. And that made for a very different experience of how they would assimilate immigrant currents from whatever origin later on in life. And it continues to be in large part that way. Argentina has been, like many Latin American countries, strongly influenced by a very conservative branch of the Catholic Church. And until the end of the Dirty War, when democracy came back to Argentina in the 1980s, when there was the last constitutional reform, was the first time in Argentina constitutional history where the tie between religion and state was broken. That is, until 1982, I think it was when the constitutional reform took place, if you wanted to be president of Argentina, the Constitution said you had to be Roman Catholic. It's only a Roman Catholic could aspire to the presidency. And that only changed in the 1980s, okay? Not so in Brazil. And the other characteristic that I would say made the integration, so the Catholic Church was a strong factor in how Jews integrated or didn't integrate into Argentine culture. Because if you looked in the United States, 3 generations after immigration, the American Jews were pretty much beginning to integrate and acculturate into the larger American scene. This didn't happen in Argentina. The Argentinian Jewish community into the 4th generation remained insular. It remained insular not only because they wanted to be insular, it remained insular because even though they have economic access and economic opportunities, culturally they were not welcome into this conservative Catholic society. The second thing that made a great difference, I think, in terms of how the Jews integrated in Argentina, is something that I commented with Dawn, and she wanted me to share with you, is the question of language. The question of language is a very important one. First of all, Argentinian Jews retained Yiddish much longer than American Jews retained Yiddish. And retained not only Yiddish, retained the language of the countries they came from, wherever they were, much longer than in American society. In American society, it was assumed that if you were an immigrant and you wanted to integrate, you learned the language of the land, and that was it. In Brazil, when the Second World War breaks out, and Brazil enters the war on the side of the Allies, German, for instance, becomes the enemy's language. So the Jews from Germany that arrived to Brazil have to quickly learn Portuguese, and in their synagogues speak Portuguese.